Hi, everybody. Lovely to see people here. We were just thinking how many of us want to stay in this particular bubble that we're all in, knowing what's happening in the world outside. Anyway, I'm going to talk through the theme of tomorrow, we will. I want to start just by paying my respects to the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people on whose land our studio is located, and to also acknowledge various peoples on whose lands we practice throughout Australia, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and acknowledge their land has not been ceded. I'm going to talk through this theme with 5 frames. Tomorrow we will inhabit today, because today's buildings will have been designed for cultural, ecological and material resilience. And there's going to be 5 targets for that. So I'm not mentioning AI, by the way, so if you're disappointed in that, go now. Diversify our empathies, refocus on the architecture of housing, strengthen civic infrastructure, reuse what we've got, and design for resilience. And I'm going to talk through a range of projects very quickly. There is a lot here, but the reason for that is because I'll show you some of our more renowned works, but which are highly bespoke. But I also want to cover a lot of ground of the ordinary everyday project, because tomorrow I would hope that every building we do is done with care and diligence and good architectural attention. So, diversify our empathies. What do I mean by that? It's really a question around who practices architecture and how we practice. And these were some of the questions when I started the practice in '94 that mattered to me. What architects looked like. The role of the architect is something that perhaps I was keen to challenge when I started as a woman leader in practice, and to be recognised in that role without necessarily having a husband partner doing that in the practice. How we might demonstrate different kinds of architectural leadership, have authority, but also kindness and capacity to listen and be responsive, and a counter, if you like, to some of the myths around the heroic 20th century architects. So showing strength and sensitivity, leadership and keen listening. So that partly meant taking on projects like infrastructure sound walls for freeways and police stations to counter the idea that actually women did housing and only housing. A little bit of background too, a scholarly practice that integrates a lot of teaching work, some research alongside practice. So this possibility of teaching programs around messiness and contingency and negotiation that is coming from practice life, and having the clarity of intent that I think comes from time in the academy. I am fascinated with this question of empathies of our various backgrounds, and more people with different backgrounds practicing in architecture will change the types of empathies we have as a discipline. I am always cautious about how much our personal histories are used or drawn upon in our practice. For instance, I wonder if my propensity for a lot of brickwork is somehow related to a family history of brickmakers. Who knows? There is a warning around uncritically drawing on personal history. But having said that, even though I would never say our buildings are gendered per se, I would say that one's experience might change how you understand and deal with a design problem. So for instance, in this project here, the Jock Comedy toilet block, the humble toilet, a very important civic infrastructure, able to draw upon memories as a woman of entering public toilets, kicking the door, etc. These are the sorts of things that influence and hopefully make for better design. And in that sense, I think is a case for expanding who practices for the different sorts of empathies we can bring to bear on projects, especially with things like health projects that need for empathy, our capacity as architects to put ourselves in the shoes of others and in the spaces of others. Some of our stats, we've always had a long-standing majority of women in the practice, which you can see across all levels within it. But I think there's a bit more to do on our team in terms of our metrics, I would say around generations and ages of practitioners too, as well as heritage. But more broadly, the determination to have rigorous design culture, but also a supportive workplace. And just, I thought, by way of a bit of history, of the gold medal in Australia, there's been more Johns than women in architecture in Australia to receive the gold medal. But I do think in terms of diversifying who practices and how, last year was a really interesting one. Leslie Loco was acknowledged with the gold medal here, in the UK. And then this was a get-together we had in our office of 3 gold medalists, myself with Maggie Edmond and Carol Ross-Barney talking gold. So there is a change, if you like, of how the role of the architect is seen and perhaps enacted. And just very briefly on that, an interest in how we work and leading while remaining alive to the various tensions in projects, resolving those, but finding some rightness of fit of a spatial model that takes on all the variables and tensions of a project in a constructive way. So, next, refocus. Tomorrow we'll refocus on the architecture of housing. Housing matters enormously. It was a fairly, I think, unfashionable endeavour for a few decades. If you tried teaching housing programs at unis, it was seen as slightly tedious, no place for speculation. Thankfully, that's changing, and I think once again, architects are focusing on housing, which matters too because of the various issues we have with housing and lack of, but also that housing forms people's homes, it forms our cities, its most construction activity is in the making of housing, it forms our streets, our suburbs, but it's also foundational to social equity. And I'm fascinated by architecture's role in the formation of home. Home could be anywhere someone feels supported in their day-to-day activities and purpose, and it's also a combination of physical space as well as our daily habits, our relationships and events. So architecture is only one part of what makes a home, and in that sense we're always having to practice space. Something I find confronting and perhaps humbling and perhaps something of humility is around the impact of architecture. If you do not have a homeland, then the most beautiful space in the world, the most beautiful architecture is perhaps nothing compared to not having your own homeland. So at a time of a lot of people being displaced, it is interesting for us to think as architects what role we play in the formation of home and a humility around the impact of that. I think also this image here, which is a collection of some of our housing plans, really represents something of the conundrum of architecture right now and housing. We have a lot, we're sort of two ends of the spectrum, the one-off bespoke house and then the, if you like, ready-to-wear multi-residential project for an unknown client. And the question of size, it's always fascinating. Australia has the largest houses. I tried to blame Americans for that last week in California, but alas, Australia has the biggest ones. There's a line through comparing some of our plans with that statistic, what people think they need or how much space for the making of home. We do some one-off houses, and I still find the single house a place for invention. For instance, here, the apartment house as a hybrid of house and apartment, a primary and a secondary dwelling, so it's a model for doubling density on suburban blocks, or building on local Victorian legacy through exploring that in the Big Hill House. The Hanging Rock House, which explored ideas about landscape and interior being contiguous and held together by a substantial rhomboid roof. Or the compact dwelling, a compact rural residence for downsizers in the ring. And then there is the more bespoke. So I thought I'd just give one example of a bespoke house and then move on to some multi-res. So this was for a photographer on a site on the Great Ocean Road, high bushfire area. All of our sites seem to be bushfire ones. And early sort of sketches through to the final house, this idea of providing her with a series of nooks for living, a house that has her back. So fire-resilient envelope made of precast concrete, internal walls that create the nooks for living, and then the resultant plan, a sort of nook for each activity in the house. So highly bespoke for someone who, as photographer, loves light and dark, a house that explores sense of darkness, relatively mute from outside, and then a device for framing the landscape outside, always with this square format, effectively a veranda being one room deep. And then this unfolding enfilade of nooks internally and the play of light with a dark ceiling. So here we have something highly bespoke for one person, and it's interesting to think, really, how can we scale something like this? Not particularly easily. So this turning our attention more to the multi-residential project, and I think an area for us all to focus at scale. Often think that typology is a key way in which we can have a big impact, setting the right bones for a project. And this is where, if we had to make a decision between doing elaborate interiors or setting the right bones for a project and the precinct through typology and the amenity, then this is probably where I'd say we can have the biggest impact right now, setting up interface with street and neighbours and one household and the next. Napier Street was a very early project of ours in 1999, a medium density project of 11 units, and it was also the beginning of thinking about putting our effort into the building envelope, the enduring bones of a project, but also the beginnings of exploring what it meant to work with the context that it's in, finding a way of somehow a hybrid of warehouse and cottage typology, speaking to that particular neighbourhood without resorting to mimicry. A case study of a private developer market housing project in Melbourne is Belfry Park Lane, on the edge of a park, and here we broke the larger block down into a cluster of 4 buildings. A key interest of ours is how private development can be used for some sort of public benefit as well. And this is where we were able to introduce a laneway into the site. So you're doing something good for the neighbourhood in the provision of private housing, the civic benefit and opportunity, as well as, of course, good amenity for the neighbours. So here's this laneway through, linking park to the street through that. A very active park frontage, so putting people rather than cars on the park frontage along the laneway, terraces, and then apartments at the upper levels. So a combination of types, finding ways in the common circulation to have a moment of interaction between kitchen, bench, and circulation. Ways of living together in productive ways. The diversity of dwelling types means diversity of household types, the importance of that, and just some images of the resultant dwellings. In that, these ones that are on the park, the townhouse types, that manage this threshold between private dwelling interior and the communal street and landscape. So a good example of setting up positive neighbourhood outcomes through the provision of housing, another reason why it matters. Kerr Street is a project that also incorporates some heritage fabric. It's a private build to rent, and it had a heritage base, and we put this new series of apartments on top with townhouses skinning the heritage. I put this diagram in to really make the point that every time we put in a planning proposal or a submission, we are effectively advocating for what we think is a better way to make our suburbs. And so these little storyboards really tell the story of why the design is the way it is, to argue for better outcomes. And in this instance, we were able to challenge and set a precedent for no setback of new fabric from a heritage base. Might not sound remarkable, but at the time, almost 20 years ago, this was a bit of a breakthrough. And that enabled us to do a perimeter block which made for a beautiful courtyard, which provided great amenity for the future occupants of this, but also benefit to the neighbours whose windows you can see in that site. So again, mutual benefit between neighbours and the project. The buildings around the courtyard, diversity of types, again, and this beautiful central garden, which is shared by both neighbours as well as the occupants. Managing privacy with sliding screens of open space beside the communal corridors. Again, the amenity of the interiors, all dual aspect, and these shared spaces as well, including rooftops and so on. Moving now to social and affordable housing project, which is currently under construction in Paran. And really, sometimes these projects, I wouldn't say are particularly groundbreaking in their typology, but it is where we've managed to achieve really high amenity for everybody. So equitable amenity of dual aspect, great views over a park, and great light. So again, same consistent approach for all of the dwellings. and forming a backdrop to the local pool as well. And then a public housing project, some public housing that is currently being built by our government in Victoria, is really attempting to find new ways of densification in these older estates which have tower blocks. A lot of contention whether the tower block should be kept. Nevertheless, this is a new portion of the site, again another cluster of 4 buildings for a smaller sense of address, smaller cohorts. Fascinating to me is that this was designed and managed during COVID, and some of the key imperatives of what makes for good housing were easier to get through at the time, like dual aspect, like great cross-flow, great light, smaller neighbourhoods of people, open-air stairwells, were easier to do then because of the health links at the time, and the importance of the balcony, people's private open space, to cope with high-density living. Questions that came out of that for us, especially conundrums for social housing, is when you're designing for everyone or designing for no one by adopting sometimes a sort of more generic language. And is architectural neutrality, does that make sense in a multicultural place like Melbourne? Romance of the commons, who common spaces work for, especially laundries, and a desire of the public tenants for their own laundries. What makes for homeliness, and points of attachment. Just to finish on the housing section, even though a lot of what some of the issues around housing are structural financial issues, I do think we can advocate for better outcomes and do our part in regards to that, of housing as a basic right. And just a reminder that we've all been aware of this for a very long time. It's been written in 1945 in Australia, and yet we are in the dilemma that we are now with that not happening. Strengthen civic infrastructure. The importance of our modest, sometimes civic buildings that dignify the everyday and celebrate the locale, where we are, why one place is different to another, a way to put us in the world. Now, like many, I had a education that gave me a lot of overseas precedents, some of them, and Eurocentric, a little bit from Japan, US, particularly Venturi. And it was interesting to me to also look at someone like Edmund and Corrigan's work, which gave us a way to act locally or draw from our own suburban vernacular. And in particular, through our police station work, these modest little buildings, we used, even though they had the same brief, it was how they might be nuanced to reflect their particular and diverse communities. So, for instance, in a greenbelt suburb that identifies as very green, a green glazed little station. Ditto Marysville, a place of timber, so timber work there. And developing new typologies for the police, a mini city of little blocks of different functional areas for a different kind of station. But other repeat building types, for instance schools, I think are fundamental, the quality of those, to creating civic infrastructure that supports community. And if you look through Melbourne, all the way through are these marvellous little buildings that have endured for a very long time, that are foundational to a suburb's community infrastructure. And so the number of public schools we've been working on are always adding to that and understood within that, the way in which a local school holds communities together. So, for instance, Northcote responds to its heritage building and speaks with that. Preston, ditto, responds to its neighbouring terraces. They each reflect their context. This one in Dandenong, on a highway, on big box retail, converts a gym into a STEM facility for schools. As a more detailed case study, Clyde Creek Primary School is where, in the formation of a new suburb, the school is one of the first bits of community infrastructure. This is what we started with. This is what eventuated. So you can see in these areas a lot of housing, not a lot of community infrastructure sometimes, and so the school becomes essential to that. So we were determined to use the school rather than plonk a series of buildings, create a more meaningful territory and central space. We were using templates. All we did was really crank those templates so that they held community better with this courtyard space, and a series of interconnecting verandas. So these are really using very conventional construction techniques, templates and so on, to make a difference with space making in those areas. Excuse me. And with places like this too, the facilities are not just for the school community, but for the broader community as well. And they adopt mainly a domestic scale, but here also a civic scale. So the gym is for everybody's use. Similarly, Fisherman's Bend, which is a university campus, an architecture and engineering one, brownfield site just outside of Melbourne's CBD. A place that has had great transformation over 10,000 years, a place that's been occupied by Millenia, by the Bunurong and Woiwurrung people of Melbourne, and how this landscape has been transformed to an industrial one through changes to its ecology. So very simply, even though it's a campus, it has created a catalyst for that precinct and introduction of a more porous set of pathways through landscape and some site repair from heavily transformed grounds. A project I presented just earlier in the civic community buildings, the Round, which was done with BKK. It's a large theatre building. So for a suburban theatre centre, very important for that local community, again in a big box landscape. So the question was how to use this as a way to make place. So a series of bites, it reflecting the adjacent conditions, these place-making possibilities around the perimeter of the building, bites out concave space to create more landscape opportunities and places for the incidental and day-to-day enjoyment of community, not just inside, but its perimeter, place to walk your dog, and so forth. This, which becomes carols by candlelight, and so on. So formal and informal community activity. We cannot talk about tomorrow without thinking about reusing what we already have, and it's always a question for us, can we use what we've already got? The idea too that there is never a clean slate. We are always starting with preconditions, Australia acknowledging more and more its pre-colonial history. Buildings that continue to be able to be changed, whether it's a fabric change or a change of use that enables new uses in existing forms. To really question what we mean by obsolescence, things like this town hall for Broadmeadows that could have been demolished but which got restored, and some strategic cuts to open it back out and give it a new lease of life. The interior palette too, so important as a repository of community memories. The stables was a former mounted police station, and it's interesting to find an ease of fit between an existing building and a new use, which is as an art school. The cellular and the good light made very good sense. 2 art students, 1 horse, which fit beautifully in those existing stable buildings. So a space of making, but also a place for exhibitions. And things like with Abbotsford Convent, where really all you can do with tightest budgets is just do compliance with a bit of poetry for access and so forth, and not try to unify all of the spaces, allow those different moments in its history to endure. Even Ugly Ducklings, these little 6-pack apartments, brown bricks, the clients thought we would just demolish it and start again, and we thought, no, actually it's a really good little building, great bones, just re-landscape and retain. Okay, I'm just going to flick through. So really a question of heritage, whether we're using it as a way to unlock the flows of our city and our sites or as an impediment. And I think we really, in tomorrow, have to make sure we're using heritage in transforming it adequately to enable new uses. I'm going to finish with 2 last projects. This one, the Holocaust Museum, which really tries to answer the brief of a Holocaust museum in quite different ways. What is the role of architecture in that? And rather than using the architecture as the point of discomfort and difficulty, which is what we've seen in these former precedents, we decided to let the programs and the survivors and people tell their stories through exhibition, a place to hold opposites together, light and dark, suffering and future. An existing building on that site of cultural value to the community, so that became the cornerstone of the new building. It became embedded within that. A very, very tight section, so gardens and light wells to relieve that. This interest in what it means to the sort of heritage from afar as well that we were dealing with, and this idea of crystal night and this threat of fragility. So a facade that is both resilient and as well as transparent and avoiding the bunker trope of a lot of museums. So here you see this sort of stitching in and patchwork of the original facade with these new elements in this glazed brick element, this weaving of the two together. A beacon at night in its glowing, a place with glimpses of gardens and ways out always, a humane palette, a gentle, humane space from which to engage with difficult content, the use of mirror for personal reflection, but also bringing in the outside landscape outside to take us away from trauma landscapes, the view of the sky, extremely important for that, to connect us back to our situation. And then as we go up the facade, the calibration to this lighter and more delicate space and beauty and calm. So a meeting of heritage and of new, both a memorial but also a place of education looking to the future for difficult ideas. And finally, the design for resilience, the sort of last interest and area for today. To shift, in particular, with our understanding of landscape as a system and as an ecology, rather than just a beautiful visual prospect. And partly this interest in this came about from a lot of walking, especially the Gularabalu Trail, the Lurajari Trail, and when you walk, you appreciate changing landscape. So how our buildings might enable the flow of landscapes and ecologies rather than impede them, first played out in the Konawara house some time ago. So an earlier museum which explored engaging with the dynamics of landscape rather than resisting them, imagining a museum that comes out of the floodplain. So a lot of these themes play out in the Bundanon Art Museum and Bridge, which is in Shoalhaven, just 2.5 hours south of Sydney. And it was here that we thought, how might a museum build for resilience, for climate adaptation, but also not impede the flows of country and in fact care for country. A place of great fires at times, but also of inundation. And yet it's also a place that the Dharawal and Wadi and Yuin people have cared for years and managed this place for millennia. So it's more the problem of how we choose to build and how we choose to settle in these dynamic landscapes. Its purpose is to foster an appreciation and understanding of art and environment. And here we see Arthur Boyd's painting on the left and the actual landscape on the right. The site was gifted from Arthur Boyd, and it's a wonderful place to compare the imaginary landscapes with the actual ones. We were interested in his painting en plein air and what that might mean for architecture, and the importance of a transdisciplinary team when you're engaging with sites like this and contemplating climate resilience, and especially Atelier 10 and Rate Associates, who were fundamental to our early concepts for this. The importance too to think of an extended site when we're thinking about resilience. We can never stop at the site boundary. We are always part of a much greater system, especially when it comes to water flows. So there we see our plan. The blue line is the proposed maximum flood level, not that anyone would trust any maximum flood level right now. And then the red is the supposed fire line. So between that is where we were able to situate these two new buildings. Part of the landscape works too was landscape repair, especially of the riparian zones along the creek edge, because this is a place, it's a wildlife sanctuary too, there's breeding programs. So it's a much more extended understanding of landscape and place. We looked to things like trestle bridges as examples of how to manage structures in places prone to inundation. And so our very simple diagram is this idea of a building form that relates to topography that is both buried and bridging to allow the overland flow, and follow and projecting to set up different climate zones and different relationships to topography for different experiences. So we have our museum, which is embedded in the hill, a subterranean space, thermally stable. And then we have the bridge, the visitors bridge, which has visitor accommodation and facilities on it, which allows the wet gully to flow below it and is climatically variable and en plein air. That mapping of different climate modes across the program is what gets mapped to the plan. So the bridge, as I say, en plein air, whereas the museum is very stable. It's a project that has to be able to stand alone and work autonomously, and so it has largely passive systems with some appropriate technologies. Also, as users, one of the ways we might connect with place is to actually engage with it and tune our room. So instead of just flicking a switch and that's it, the aircon's on, interesting to say that standing in Singapore, here you can adapt the light, the airflow and so on through very, very dumb analogue systems. And I will say, as an aside, tomorrow we might have more really dumb systems, because sometimes I would say our buildings are becoming so smart that they're unusable. Anyway, that's an aside. So very quickly, a little walkthrough of the final project, this idea of the museum as a whole of site and building for climate resilience. So approaching the bridge as a datum, which registers those beautiful gullies of the Shoalhaven Hill and landscape. The mini bridge leading to the main facilities, which helps you escape in the event of inundation. When we first arrive in the main plaza, you can see the bridge spanning over the wet gully, allowing the flow underneath, and I have experienced that. It's pretty phenomenal. The double roof, the protected open-air cafe space where the bridge meets the ground. And then the museum front, which is fire resistant, so the concrete, a very different tectonic, and you see those existing heritage buildings in the corner. So in the museum space itself, we really have a sense of mass being subterranean, this fantastic groundedness, experience of that. It's big enough to handle really, really large environmental works, which we can see here. And then also a very strong programming, especially of First Nations and Aboriginal artists, as other ways into understanding country and relationships to place in new ways. And now back to the bridge, and you can get a little glimpse of the Glen Murcutt building through there, which was our neighbour in this. So heading back along, the sense of prospect that we get from the bridge, a very different experience of place. These open-air learning spaces which divide the pavilions underneath the big long roof and look back to that heritage cluster. These key rooms also ways to frame that beautiful landscape, and in particular some of the key views that Arthur painted a lot. Points at which we're just suspended above the gully, again as ways to connect you to place through the feeling and experience of that suspension, of that climate, feeling hot sometimes and so forth. Walking along the passageway to the different accommodation rooms, very modest little bedrooms, the colours of the sky from Arthur's paintings. Then at night, this sort of lantern suspended in this very beautiful place. You can see there it's 160 metres long, a lot of PVs along that roof. And here, this path from earth to air. And just to sort of wrap up, so really a project like this, which is tomorrow designing for resilience so that the flow of country is unimpeded by its buildings, and tomorrow that we might make buildings and landscapes that are integrous, of conceptual clarity, that are both gentle and strong, subtle and transformative. But finally, that tomorrow we will inhabit today, because today's buildings will have been designed for cultural, ecological and material resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerstin. While our minds are on that last, it's is it an art centre, a gallery, or could you just remind us how you conceive of it?
Absolutely. There was a lot to get through, so I skipped a bit of detail. It's actually a museum. That's the building embedded in with a huge collection of its own, a collection store and a museum. And then on the bridge, it's dining rooms, cafe, and a series of learning spaces and
so it has its own collection?
It does, it does.
And is any of that ancestral?
That's a very good question, actually. I think increasingly so. And I think a big part of the project now in its programming is to shift it from being a 20th century modernist collection of a very particular type of Australian art to a lot more programming with First Nations and Indigenous, so shifting some of those perceptions through the
Because in a way, I think that's at the nub of what you show. Because I find your work incredibly careful. It's very respectful, empathetic. You don't shout. You're more, I don't think you're interested in shouting, and there are some Australian architects who are kind of willingly make kind of folie. You're an anti-folly person, I think. And that sort of must be quite difficult.
Would anyone in the audience like to comment on that, in the Australian audience? I think I do like the idea, and that is an example of that a building might have its moments of having enormous strength and visual impact, for instance, and at other times disappearing. And that sort of interplay, that it can be both strong.
It's a quality. I'm not being critical.
No,
I'm just observing.
Yeah.
But there was, with the museum, did you ever at any time consider getting rid of all that structure underneath the flying? Would have flown across the valley?
Yeah,
or would that be, do you like all the structure underneath?
I do.
I think you do.
Yeah, I do like it. And partly too because it's where it plays with the forest behind it, which happens to have some blackened tree trunks as well because of bushfires. And so there's times where the structure becomes part of that. So the vertical helped settle it into that setting as well.
Because you call it a bridge. It's more like, to me, it's like a viaduct.
Yeah, no, you're right. Okay, we'll rename it the viaduct. Yeah. No,
so
fair point.
another question that something I wrote down was really about working in post-industrial urban landscape, or cities that have got ex-factories, and the way that European cities have changed, and perhaps Singapore hasn't gone through that phase. Maybe it will one day.
It makes a lot of ground.
But there are a few there's a Raffles Hotel and a few kind of brave kind of survivors from the colonial past. But you've got more of that stuff in Australia. You've got kind of very utilitarian kind of buildings from its colonial past. And when you show the schools, all the little schools, and they've got little kind of Victorian-y bits and twiddles, and perhaps some of the most desirable houses in Australia have a colonial past. How do you feel about all of that?
I think the point is that with our heritage industry, I would like it to be be able to value more moments of our history. And unfortunately, it's been very mono in what it has deemed worthy of our heritage attention or value, and has overlooked really other aspects of it. For instance, cultural landscapes. If there's not a building on it and it's not Victorian, then it can't be heritage. Well, actually, of course it can be of great meaning, and this is something we're starting to appreciate. But I think too, and where I sort of touched on this idea of heritage as either a pathology or a propeller, it's a Rossi quote, by the way.
It's what?
But it's an Aldo Rossi quote. But it's a beautiful way, I think, of challenging us to say, is it not better to allow some change of some revered heritage artefact if you can unlock a whole lot of new uses and integrate it into the flow of the city?
So how do you go about that? Do you have any Aboriginal trained architects in your studio?
We do, actually, yes. But I think...
But is that a conscious decision that we need to have some kind of balance?
I definitely think it goes back to that first point, that tomorrow we will have diverse empathies, that the more diversity we have in who practices and what experiences they can bring to bear on projects, the better we will be, I think, at reflecting a diverse world. But I think too, I would hope that in the studio, it's not just the Aboriginal architect who bears responsibility for this thinking. We all do, and I definitely think that's a big shift in practice in Australia at the moment, is that attention and consideration within practices. Yeah.
Well, I recall going to give talks in Melbourne, and the journalist would always ask me, is there an Australian kind of design? And I always found it such a ridiculous question, because how was I going to know? I'd been there 24 hours or something. But is there?
I think I can't say there's not, and having started one part of the talk about the importance of registering the differences of different neighbourhoods even. So I think you can get very granular of buildings responding to a sense of place. And I think it's more interesting, less in a nationalistic sense, and more in the particularities of, say, this neighbourhood over that one. That's where I think discussions around place become really interesting. That's something I hope we do with our projects.
You do. I think you've shown that very well today. The kind of careful attention to what is there and what it can be.
Yeah.
And sometimes in restoration, when you restore, say, a fresco, it's absolutely imperative that the restoration is distinguished from the original art. And I noticed you doing that with I think another arts project with a house with the gables, and then you buried it in a sort of surrounded it with a concrete wall, almost as though it was camouflaged.
Yes.
And then you painted it all the same colour.
Exactly. Yes.
As a sort of blending.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to an interest in, and you can put this down to my 1980s education probably, but an interest in undoing some of the opposites that have made for a lot of architecture, that new has to be different to old, or that this can't look like that. And I think actually juxtaposition is not always the thing. You could have a more subtle relationship and consideration between different moments in a building. Does that make sense?
And I think in that building, as you go up, the walls become filters for light, and you use a very regular material. I don't know whether it's
just
brick
glass
or
bricks
block
and clay bricks
to make sort of. I thought that was very beautiful. Anyway, lovely work, Kerstin. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for sharing it with
Pleasure.
all of us.
Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much.